We have heard so many beautiful stories tonight, and our final speaker is going to bring that all home for us. Christine Gentry is the Director of Teacher Development and Licensure at City on a Hill Charter Public Schools, and she believes in the power of listening to one another's stories, especially in the classroom, as a way to spark powerful change.
So teachers aren't generally drawn to the profession by the promise of great money, fame, and power. I mean, those people might exist, but they get real disappointed real quick. Every teacher I have ever met got into teaching because they care about kids. We all want our students to feel successful and cared for, but we also have to concern ourselves with things like covering massive amounts of content, meeting state standards, and preparing our kids for high-stakes tests and exams. So with the very best of intentions, we gather all the information we can about our students' academic lives. We track their grades, we track their participation, we give formative and summative assessments, we use that data to inform our instruction, we create early warning indicator spreadsheets that track how many classes a student is failing, how many absences they have, how many dean sends detentions. And to be clear, I'm not saying that these are bad practices, right? Or that they have no place in school. I'm just trying to tell you that I sat in a meeting once to decide if a shy, struggling kid needed special education services. And about a week later, that kid showed up to school wearing sandbags strapped around his wrist. And he had them hidden under a long-sleeved t-shirt. And he walked over to another kid, and he started beating the crap out of him. He knew the sandbags would make him hit harder. And it turns out that that kid had been viciously bullying him every day after school for months, and none of us knew. Because too often, school emphasizes the academic over the personal. In my early years of teaching, I was at a public high school in Boston that required me to teach 10 novels and assign 12 literary analysis essays a year. Setting aside the time to get to know my kids just really didn't feel like an option. So I started doing journal entries with prompts connected to the content, because I did have time for that. And I found myself building relationships with my kids on the page. And then as they became more comfortable sharing those entries out loud, I saw them build relationships with each other. And then I got to teach a creative writing class where kids were crafting personal narratives, and I got to see that process turbocharged. Kids were working harder than I'd ever seen them work. They were producing better written products than anything I'd ever seen. And my relationships with them were deepening in ways I'd never experienced. The more I got to know my students, the harder they worked for me, the better they behaved. It was almost as if I were making deposits into some kind of interpersonal connection bank and then writing and cashing checks to get kids to achieve what I knew they were capable of, academically or behaviorally. I was banking on relationships. And what I've come to understand is that relationships are the currency of instruction. Students work harder for teachers they love, and you can't love someone that you don't know. And I can hear you saying, "What are you asking me to do, lady?" I do not have time. I got all this to cover, and my kids come in behind. Or as a school board member once said to me, relationships don't close opportunity gaps. But I believe that they can. And I also believe that if your students perceive you promoting things like test performance over things like interaction and mutual respect, that their motivation and engagement will decline. And that will negatively affect your instruction and their learning. Because if there's no personal connection to school, or worse, no motivation to go to school, then what good will dozens of essays do? And of course, academics are important. Of course they are. I'm not asking you to sacrifice the academic for the personal. I'm asking you to strengthen the academic with the personal. I'm asking you to value both. So how do you do that? How do you build the kinds of relationships with kids that will let you create safe learning environments where kids are authentically engaged and academically successful? You must allow yourself and your students to bear witness to each other's lives. And you can start doing that in small ways, like journal entries or personal narrative writing. But students don't tend to share their writing in very public ways, right? In my class, publication celebrations were students silently moving around the room, reading and commenting on each other's work. I have a former student here who remembers that. And it was beautiful, but it didn't really feel like bearing witness. And then in 2008, I fell in love with The Moth. Do you guys know it? It's a storytelling nonprofit, very simple premise. It's just people telling stories on stage, right? No notes, just them and the mic. And I will never forget the first time I put my name at a Moth Story Slam. I told a story about an end of a major relationship, and at the end, the host gave me a giant hug, and he gave me a swig of his whiskey. And at intermission, so many people came up to me to tell me they'd been through something similar, or just to assure me that I'd be okay. And on the subway ride home, I was just so moved. I was like, this is something. Like, this could be a way for my students to truly bear witness to each other, minus the whiskey. It's like, what if I explicitly taught my kids how to choose and craft stories from their lives, and then allowed them to publicly perform those stories? And so I hunted the people at the Moth Central office down, and I charmed them into letting me work for them. And then I eventually devoted my entire dissertation to exploring how storytelling can help kids navigate their identities and create stronger connections to each other and to us and to school. And I saw storytelling increase student motivation. I saw it decrease behavioral issues. I saw it create community between kids who'd never really interacted before. And I saw it help students make sense of the major events and relationships in their lives. I once had a 16-year-old basically write my entire dissertation for me when she said, "You know, Miss, the painful things that happen in our lives are the ones we have the most emotions about, right? And those emotions tend to get like jumbled and confused and twisted because we got a lot of them, and they don't know what to do with each other, so they're like vines, and they tangle in each other and they just freeze. And when you take that painful thing and you tell a story about it, it's like untangling those vines and laying them out. So that not only does it make sense to everyone else, but in the process it's making more sense to you." I was like, I'm not going to be able to come up with anything better than that. And I didn't. And another time, the teacher whose classroom I was working in said, "You know, I just find storytelling helps with everything. Like, I don't really have disciplinary issues after storytelling units. Like, once those students start showing themselves to each other, once that trust is built, I don't really have disciplinary issues. And if I do, they're small. They're teenager stuff, right? Not the big things that used to happen in class." And I need to be very clear with you tonight that storytelling is not a magic wand, right? The power of public, personal storytelling is, like all powerful things, double-edged, and it shouldn't be used lightly. You can't do this work without being prepared. I would argue without being trained to listen for trauma, to help kids untangle those vines, to help them decide whether going public with a story is safe, and to help them understand that we should tell stories from our scars and not our wounds. But I have seen that granting students the time and the space to bear witness to each other's lives can improve classroom community and student motivation in such powerful ways. And connected, motivated students with access to strong curriculum and instruction are academically successful. That is how relationships close opportunity gaps. I train teachers now through a program called the Urban Teaching Fellowship. And I often tell my fellows, when you run into your former students on the T or at Target or on the street, and you will, they will never remember the grade that you gave them. And they won't remember half of the content that you taught them. But as Maya Angelou would say, they will absolutely remember what it felt like to be in your class. We can't separate who we are from what happens in our classrooms, and neither can our students. So our classrooms must be spaces where we can bring our most authentic selves. It is our responsibility as educators to bear witness to our students' lives and to create space for them to be each other's witnesses. Make room for the personal, and you'll see gains in the academic. Thank you.
Well, what an evening. If you have ever come to an Ed Talks before, you know that this is the portion of the evening where I say, this is the best Ed Talks we've ever had. But I have to tell you, this is the best Ed Talks we've ever had.